Welcome back. We've done it again. Ravi's not. Ravi's not
Maybe
here.
Ravi doesn't exist.
We
Maybe.
need to. Yeah, it feels like a running joke. We'll never have Ravi. We have a. I'm not sure I actually told you. I've booked Ravi in for Friday, this week.
Have you?
At 10 a.m. I have a message from him saying it's a date. So me, if you're not there, me and Ravi are having a date.
Okay. Okay.
So we were supposed to have done it last week, and we was like a perfect storm. If he didn't see my message, and then your little girl was ill.
Yeah. Last day of school.
Yeah.
Missed everything. Devastated.
Yeah. So we ended up not being able to do it. So we're doing this episode. It's Monday now, and I'll release it tonight. I'm gonna go home. We have a meeting, and I'll go home and I'll edit it as quick as possible and get it out straight away. So we thought we'd do a bit of a. I don't want to call it like a filler, because I thought it'd be really interesting for us to do an episode on this, because we talked fairly recently. We had Alex come on and she gave her talk about some of her PhD work. I thought it might be interesting for us to talk about what even is a PhD, like what's a doctorate, because we've both done a PhD, and I think I oftentimes get students will kind of say like, I don't really know what it means, what does it entail doing one, what does it represent, and like titles. You probably get this a lot.
Mm-hmm. It's the confusion, I think, between what is a PhD and what's a professional doctorate, and quite often students will think of it synonymously. I think we also tend to get differences between students maybe who are home, or sort of like domestic students versus international. I don't know whether, again, the terms can be used more interchangeably sometimes, but yeah.
The big one for me that I get all the time, and it gets to a point where sometimes I just kind of get fed up and I'm like, you know what, let's just use what the students come up with, is professor. I get called professor a lot, and I'm always like, not a professor, not a professor, I'm not a professor, no, not a professor. In America, professor is a job title. You're conferred professor status for basically just being a lecturer. Mm-hmm. And in the UK, a professor is a very highly, like it's the highest rank of title. It's not like you're a doctorate. You do your doctorate, but you can keep going up the rank. So I'm a lecturer, you're assistant professor.
I am, but in teaching, and that's the other thing that makes it confusing, because I wouldn't have, as far as I know, the right to use professor.
No, well, you wouldn't get professor with that either.
Okay.
I think so. This is where it gets messy. Like, this is why we're talking about it. So I know several professors that are on the equivalent contracts that we're on. So you can get professorship through like the education pathway. The idea is that professor is more associated with the education, teaching side of stuff than research. Research feeds into it, but the idea is if you're a researcher with professor status, you've also been teaching a lot of the stuff that you've done and developed that side by side. Mm-hmm. And this is where it gets kind of like messy and muddy. So as an assistant professor, there are different naming conventions, and it's based off of how old the university is, it seems. Here, so you've got assistant professor. Some of the universities you'd be a senior lecturer, and they're the same rank. And then you've got a reader, and it's associate professor, I think, is the next.
Yes, associate professors would be the next one.
And then professor is that top rank. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So in the UK, professor is like, you've been working for decades. You've got like a really like major profile for what you're doing. And in America, it's just you teach. I'd be a professor in America. Just as it is, and it's not like a legally conferred or like earned title. I know that it's not always the same though. So I've got some colleagues in Sweden, and one of them got made a professor, and she's been teaching for a good while. But from what I've heard from them, it's not as, I don't know if you want to call it like strenuous as the UK system. You still earn it, but like it's not as much as required to do it. And I think this leads a lot into like this confusion around what is this whole system, like what do you have to do, what do you need, because lots of people use it differently. And I think with America kind of like dominating media, that like professor, again, we both get called professor all the time, and it's always like, I'm not a professor, but let's continue. And when you talk to people, whenever you put like media out, sometimes you kind of go, well, you might call me professor. I'm not a professor, but you might call me one. If I ever talk to like random people on the internet and they're like, "What do you do?" I'll go, I'll say like, "Oh, I'm a lecturer. I teach psychology." And then I usually add, "You'd probably call me a professor though." But like, bear in mind, it's not the same thing. I don't know if you.
I used to get that. So it used to annoy me before I got promoted to professor. So I got assistant professor. So I got promoted to assistant professor probably about 2.5, coming up to 3 years ago. And prior to that, when I used to say, "Oh, you know, what is it that you do?" I used to get quite annoyed that I'd have to say lecturer at university, because again, you can be a lecturer at lots of different levels, and I felt like I didn't want to say I'm a doctor, because people automatically assume medical doctor, and then you have to kind of like say,
we'll talk about that. I've got notes on that.
Yeah, not a medical doctor. Then I used to think about saying, well, I'm a psychologist, but then people would assume that I'm a clinical or a counselling or some kind of like chartered psychologist, which again, you know, I'm eligible to be a chartered psychologist in academia, teaching and research, but I'd never gone down the route to get my chartership just because it costs money.
I did it, and I'm the same. Whenever it comes to having to pay to renew my chartership, I'm always like,
it's such a pay for thing, and I don't really agree with having to pay for sort of like letters. So just in my mind, I'm happy with the fact that I tick the box. I don't need to actually like pay for it.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say chartered psychologist, because again, people sort of like misunderstand it. But then I feel like when we used to say lecturer in psychology, it didn't quite sum up what I felt I'd achieved. So at least now I'm kind of over that next band. I can sort of say, "Oh, I'm an assistant professor in," and then people tend to react quite differently to that. So they have more of a reaction to the word professor than they do lecturer. But I'm still confused over whether or not I can use professor on my bank card. And I don't think I can.
You have to have full professorship for it.
Okay, and the only way for me to do that would be to sort of move up through the teaching grades to like a grade 10.
You'd have to be.
Okay.
If your job title says professor, I think there's like a ceremony. You get like an actual ceremony when you become a professor, like you do with like a doctorate or even like an undergrad or a master's. I think there's like a minor ceremony that you get that goes, "Hey, you're a professor." Believe part of it requires you to give a public lecture. And so you'll sometimes see random people giving a public lecture because that's part of their like build up to apply for a professorship over the next like year or two.
And would that, so that's the set of men, we're getting really into sort of like our work-based structure now, but
we'll go back to, it's all relevant.
And is that, because I mean, obviously, at Coventry, again, we have quite different streams of sort of like teaching and research. So I remember when I moved over here from Warwick, and at the time, it was the very last bit of my PhD, and my director of studies at the time was I'm sure she was a reader, I think. And there was a point at which she got promoted to professor, and it was quite a big deal, but again, it was professor within that sort of like research stream. But for us, it would be a case of so at the moment I'm grade 8 assistant professor, it would be a case of being promoted to one of our curriculum lead roles or associate head roles, which are grade 9, which are the same as associate professor.
Yeah, which
and
would
then
be
it's
reader.
Above that is, I believe, associate dean and also head of school, a grade 10, and that's professor upwards, I think.
However, I think there's going to be an aspect where the university might also play the role of, like, do they confer the job title the same way? Because you can be, and I've seen deans of school and stuff that aren't professors. Usually they are, but I have seen that they don't always have to be. And so I think it's one of those, like, if you've reached professor, you've genuinely worked in that field for long enough that, like, you can now show other people how to do that, and that's where you then get that like leadership position. So I don't know if it's always necessarily like you would expect them to be quite highly positioned either way, but I suppose it depends on how the university wants to treat it. I wouldn't be surprised if some universities had, you know, a dean of studies that was just a reader kind of level rather than a professor level. It just depends on how they want to treat it, because this goes back to some of the stuff that I've got. The doctorate, and kind of like one of the things we wanted to talk about, does sometimes inconsistently get applied when it comes to employment. So I know my previous university, for example, the main university had the line of you had to have a PhD, you had to have a doctorate in that field to teach it, or at least a similar enough field. But I also worked for another college in the same university where their guideline was you had to hold the degree at the level that you were teaching or higher. So I was teaching up to masters, I had to have a master's degree to teach that. And that's obviously a bit of a jump between you've got a master's or you've got a PhD to be able to teach basically the same stuff.
That's
you
true.
Can't have a PhD student, you can't supervise if you don't have a PhD, but like you can teach the same master's level and stuff like that. And I know, like, again, sometimes universities do it where it's like if you have a master's and you're doing a PhD, they'll let you do that. My previous university, I think on paper they say if you're about to finish your master's, then they'll consider you. Oh, sorry, if you're about to finish your PhD, then they'll consider you. So I think there's different levels of how like tight they want to control that. So a PhD, philosophy, in a doctorate in philosophy doctorate. The name of it. So you
confusing.
mentioned the medical doctor. So I went and I did a bit of searching for this.
Because there are many. I don't know them all off by heart either. So
There's lots of different types. A lot of them are professional. So for example, my PhD is in educational sciences. And sometimes people think that that's an educational doctorate, so an EdD, and it's not. That's more practitioner-based one, similar to like a ClinD, a clinical doctorate for clinical mental health.
Or so a PhD.
Yeah, or the PhD, where you actually physically work. You do maybe a bit of research on the side, but it's predominantly you are doing practice, and you get like gauged on that. So doctor is originally Latin for to teach. So the name doctor means that you are teaching. That's what that was devised for. Originally it was used by the Christian Church to denote anybody that was able to teach about the Bible, and the like standard level changed. They basically had a course. You had to pay for a course and through the church, and then they'd let you do it. Then eventually they made it free, and this is like, we're talking like, I think it was like 1189, I think, AD, they made it free, and there was this whole conversation about it. This is based on what I read online.
I love your research.
I was like, I'm going to go and
great. I learned so much. I'm just like, what?
Just figure a little bit out. And then I think in the 13th century, I believe it was the University of Paris, I've not written down which exact one, but I think it was the University of Paris, was given the right by the Pope to allow them to confer doctor status to anybody based off of doing a degree. So you had doctorate degrees. The issue is a bit of a mess, because from what I could see, you didn't necessarily have to do a doctorate to be able to call yourself a doctor. You could do something at a lower level, but how people considered you changed.
I mean, sorry to interject, but that's also been true for a very long time, even in some of the applied fields. So I'll just quickly, we'll probably come back to this, but obviously my area is education. It wasn't until that long ago that actually you could be an educational psychologist and only have done an MSc. Because it was an MSc before it was a doctorate. And I know this from sort of like dates and research and obviously what I teach, but 2006 was the first professional doctorate in educational psychology.
Okay, so not that long, 20 years we've had it.
Not that long, yeah. Before that, it was a master's level qualification.
Okay, so hundreds of years that's been going on, basically. It's the medical thing that tends to be the big kicker for everybody. So medical doctors don't do PhDs, they don't do a doctorate, they don't get educated to the level of doctorate, in fact, oftentimes. So anybody could use the doctor label historically, and it ended up leading to a lot of very shady people claiming to be doctors, and you couldn't really do anything about it. And apparently in 1858 in the UK, they created a law saying you have to have a doctorate to be called a doctor, legally, otherwise legal trouble. Then the medical doctors complained and went, well, we've been calling ourselves doctors and now we can't because we don't have doctorates, but we're still medical professionals. And so a year later, the UK government came back and went, fine, you can also be a doctor if you've completed a medical degree. So a doctorate in the international qualification level is a level 8 degree. So we've got level 8 as a doctorate, level 7 is a master's, level 6 is third year of undergrad, 5 is second year, level 4 is the first year of undergraduate, level 3 is like college level.
The A-levels,
yeah. Yeah, A-levels.
Or a foundation year.
Yeah. Foundation year kind of allegorical to the A-level. So the doctorate is a level 8, but interestingly, to be a medical doctor, you only have to do it to level 7, so a master's level. So when a medical doctor uses the title doctor, you don't always necessarily know if they're educated to the same level. That being said, I think there's also this implication of like how much it matters.
Matters to me because now I'm going to feel more smug when I walk into a doctor's surgery.
Yeah. Oh, you're Dr. So-and-so, are you?
Because I always get it back the other way, where like I swear I've been in doctor's surgeries before, and they've kind of like looked at my records or whatever and been like, oh, doctor, whatever, and I'm just like, yeah, but like I've got a PhD, and I always feel like they need to clarify, and then I feel like they look at me like I'm not as kind of you know trained as them, but actually it's the other way around. Well, possibly.
We often there is this thing though. I remember a few years ago, there was a journal. It was like the African Journal of Medicine or something like that. It was a journal in Africa, and there was this big like hoo-ha on academic Twitter, and it was because they'd hired a couple of medical doctors in America to write statistics guides, how to use Excel to do like a t-test, things like that, basic stuff for this medical journal in Africa. And there was a lot of complaints that, well, if it's an African-based journal, they should get people in Africa to do it and not outsource them and pay money to people in another country, because it's, you know, decentralization of that education's an important topic. But interestingly, they got it wrong. The medical doctors were wrong on how to do it, and they had an error in it. And it then drove up this big conversation, and I'm going to start firing shots now. But there was this big conversation about how a lot of the time medical doctors tend to be overconfident. That's what I saw as being the conversation. I am absolutely nowhere near familiar enough with medical doctors to say if that's actually the case or not. But there's this big discussion that medical doctors tend to assume, and this is kind of based on what you said, everybody automatically assumes if you're a medical doctor, oh, you're clever, you know stuff. Mm-hmm. And even I would. You know, when I've got a problem and I'm like, I don't know what to do, I'm like, I've got to go see a doctor because I don't know. And I don't even trust myself to like Google my symptoms and like figure it out being like a doctor in a different topic. And so I think there's this like point where we overestimate just how much doctors know. And I think that this is kind of tragic at some points, because you hear about these cases where medical doctors misdiagnose people. And I think it's really sad. From the perspective, like everybody's perspective, if you get misdiagnosed with something and then it ends up being fatal because of that misdiagnosis, there's always that point that we expect medical doctors to be 100% right all the time. And when they're not, we assume that it's negligence and not like the system. Because this is something that I talked to first years about actually last week, which is that the rare health conditions are overwhelmingly diagnosed by the newest doctors. The old doctors see the same stuff all the time. It's a flu, it's a flu, it's a flu, it's a flu. And then when you get those symptoms and it's not a flu, but it looks like it, they just automatically assume it's the same as everything else. Because based off of exposure and statistics, probability, what's the likelihood that it's a flu? 99.999% chance. What is the chance that you are that 0.0001%? It's not even worth for them like thinking about. And that's why sometimes people get sent for all these tests that are like, it was useless, if you knew this you wouldn't have run that task. Well, they didn't know it in that original place. So there's this like weird thing that we always assume doctors always just know it, and if they get it wrong it's negligence, and I think that's always quite interesting.
I think, yeah, I've had this discussion with my partner before, because I think he is of that similar kind of, so he's he's currently within academia, but his stuff is very much sort of like music, tech, engineering, audio, all those kind of things. So he's not kind of he's more practically on the practical artistic side of things rather than being kind of like maybe more over in like the theoretical side of things. And we always have this argument where, like, because he will go to the doctor and he'll get frustrated, exactly as you just said, that they either don't have the answer, are going to send for a load of tests, or that they could be wrong or they could have missed something. And I have to sort of say to him, well, yeah, but you've got human error. Like, human error is a thing. You cannot expect doctors to be right all of the time. And I think sometimes we get it a little bit in that people know that we're assistant professors, they know that we're doctors, but they also assume that we know probably a lot more than we possibly do.
Yeah.
We've still spent time acquiring knowledge about our different area of expertise, but I couldn't tell you very much about, I don't know, sports psychology, for example. We thought about talking about the World Cup today because obviously it's just happened, and I was just like, it's really relevant, maybe we should. But in all honesty, I could tell you about 3 or 4 studies that I remember about why a team is more likely to win a football match, and the stuff around how if like you're the home team and you're away or something, you're statistically more likely, all these kind of things. But it's like a really, I don't know much at all, and just because I have that title of sort of like doctor in psychology does not mean that I know all psychology. But yeah, with medical doctors, I imagine it's really hard.
I wouldn't want to be in that position. No, I mean that's always something, like, I consider myself quite broad in terms of my knowledge of psychology, just because of teaching, and I'm sure you probably feel at least most part the same. When you teach so many different modules, you just learn stuff that you wouldn't normally. And then I think that's sometimes a risk when you get to like the research level like job, where you're so enveloped in your specific topic that it is very, very like the point of a needle specific stuff, and there's not really much like breadth around it. And that's kind of part of that fight almost with that position. I mean, I'm constantly telling students, you know, fight back with me, argue with me. I will get stuff wrong. One of my things I do with my project planning module with the master's students, and it's the first module they do, oftentimes I've got very little experience with research, is I'll pull up a copy of my research paper, one of the ones I've got online, and I'll go, here's a paper, here's generally what they do, and I'm like, how much do you trust this? And they're like, well, it's published, of course I trust it. And I went, I can tell you right now that researcher doesn't know what the hell he's on about. And they're like, what do you mean? And then I scroll up and I'm like, it's me. I'm like, okay, yeah, I know what I'm talking about, but like, why do you automatically assume that what I have said is correct? And it's one of those exercises to just be like, you should be questioning that stuff. You should never take it as an assumption. I've been frazzling the first year's brains recently talking about fake research that exists and paper mills and like why people might create and falsify research, but also the accidents that happen. Sometimes you accidentally analyze your data wrong or whatever, it can happen, and the importance of like diversity in evidence and like really like building up a solid base to convince your audience, and it's a lot to handle. You know, that's one of the core skills that I think it takes 3 years to develop that in an undergraduate. It takes years to like get into that frame of mind, and getting them to go, just because I'm a doctor doesn't mean that I know what I'm on about most of the time. Like, yeah, okay, sometimes I will, but like it's trying to create that bridge essentially. The idea of a doctorate, so Doctor of Philosophy is a PhD. So here philosophy isn't like the theoretical field of philosophy, but is the original like Latin name reflecting knowledge. So a Doctor of Knowledge, so I teach knowledge, is basically the translation of a PhD. And that's, I suppose, like one of those things we tend to not really recognise as like a society. You assume somebody with a PhD is not always somebody that teaches knowledge almost. Do you know how many PhDs the UK as a country gives out every year?
Wow.
A rough estimate.
A rough estimate every single year.
Just as a country, our country alone.
What, so England or the whole of the UK?
The UK, yeah, the UK.
I don't know how many universities there are registered in the UK. If I had to make an educated guess, I'd need more information.
There's I think over 250 universities in the UK.
Okay. And I guess universities probably confer in each subject per year maybe between 2 and 5. And then, but that would be multiplied by every subject that's offering a PhD times the amount of universities. So hundreds of thousands probably.
Not quite that much.
Oh, okay.
No, not quite. 28,000 in 2017.
Okay.
So across the UK. Do you know how much of the UK population holds a PhD or a doctorate?
I think when you look at the whole population, it would be quite small.
Yeah.
Like 0.1%.
It's actually quite high compared to that. It's 2%.
That's really high.
That's a lot higher than I would expect.
Yeah.
Like,
when you talk about prevalence rates of, like, I don't know, so many children will have whatever, like, you know, that seems like a lot.
There are diseases and disorders that you would look at and go, oh yeah, that's quite rare. And go, having a doctorate is more common than having, yeah. So yeah, 2% of the UK population hold roughly, on average, across the whole world, it's slightly less than 2% of the world's population holds one. So obviously there's different rates. America and China pump them out. America, I think, they in 2017 pumped out around 75,000 compared to 28 in the UK. But population density comparison, I don't know that number off the top of my head, but realistically we're pretty high in terms of how many we have. And that's one of those, like, one of UK's identity is like science and education, and we've got like we advertise ourselves as having like world class education, so I think that kind of like pushes in with that.
And does this include PhDs and other types of doctorates?
I believe so, yeah. Okay. It was just doctorates was just what it said. And they're all like estimates and so on. But yeah, so and it's always, I always find it quite interesting when you look at, we're surrounded by people with doctorates. And do you know how long the average PhD takes? So they take between 3 and 8 years. Mm-hmm. Any idea how long they take in the UK on average?
I think we should start by saying how long it took us.
Yeah, okay. Tell us about your PhD. Give us a 5-minute whirlwind of your PhD.
Oh, the elevator pitch.
Yeah, 5 minutes is more than an elevator. That's a very long elevator.
That's a very long elevator. So when you're doing your PhD, they will constantly, well, if you choose to do one, they will constantly tell you to always have an elevator pitch prepared, because you never know who you're going to meet, where you just have to rattle off in like sort of a minute basically what it is that you're looking at. And I used to hate this because I can't do anything quickly or be on time ever or do anything. So like to me, to kind of like sort of reduce it down to one snapshot was always really, really hard. And it used to make me really nervous kind of thinking about it, because I felt like I couldn't do it justice by getting it into sort of like a minute.
Don't even snapshot it. Like take like 5 minutes.
Try and go around it.
What do you think are the important things for us to know about your experience?
My PhD, I looked at, and I can do it now because I've done this for many, many years, so I've had to sort of like summarise it. So for my PhD, I looked at memory, executive function and attention in children with or without literacy or language difficulties. So they either had dyslexia, developmental language disorder, or some kind of combination of both. They also could have had like kind of comorbid sort of like challenges with autism and ADHD as well. So I was kind of looking at their underlying cognitive profile in terms of their strengths and needs. So did they have difficulties in verbal working memory, verbal short-term memory? Did they have difficulties in visual short-term memory, working memory? And the idea was to kind of try and disambiguate this overlap between literacy difficulty and language difficulty, because 50% of children with dyslexia will also have co-occurring language difficulties. So we were sort of like saying, well, if we know we've got this huge overlap, what on the potential kind of like cognitive sort of like underlying kind of level might be explaining this pattern? And we basically found, I think, roughly what we would expect. So children with dyslexia had a very big range of kind of like verbal difficulties. So whether or not they were doing things like verbal inhibition or kind of like verbal memory, short-term memory, working memory, whatever it was, if you had that kind of verbal load, or that sort of like, or maybe because we did things like a verbal Stroop task, those different things, you'd expect to see some kind of difficulty there. And their most prevailing difficulty was like a challenge with verbal short-term memory. children with kind of like comorbid difficulties tended to have a much broader picture, so they'd sort of have like kind of verbal challenges but also non-verbal challenges. So you'd also see things like kind of difficulty with a Corsi blocks task, which is kind of like a visual, you tap squares in a certain order rather than kind of like reciting digits, and the spans get longer. So those with comorbid difficulties also had visual difficulties. And then we also had a very small group that had just pure language difficulties, and they actually had kind of like relative strengths in different areas, which maybe explained why they'd only ever developed language difficulties but not gone on to develop literacy difficulties. So, in short, it kind of gave us a good profile of maybe a way of identifying these kids earlier based on their kind of cognitive strengths. But it took me 5 years to do my PhD.
How was your experience?
How was my experience? Interesting. So mine wasn't particularly straightforward in that I changed institutions as well. So I was lucky in that I got awarded a studentship. I did my undergrad at Warwick. I got awarded a studentship. Didn't do a master's. Went straight from undergrad straight into my PhD.
Was that 1+3? Or
what do you mean?
That's where you do like a 4-year PhD. The first year is technically a master's. All right. Okay.
No, it wasn't. But the reason that I asked was because it very much felt like that, if that makes sense. So I would not necessarily recommend that anybody goes from their undergraduate into their PhD, even though it's perfectly possible. And when I tell people that, they get excited because they're just like, oh, I can skip an MSc. Because I did very much feel like my first year was kind of catching up on all of those sort of skills that I probably needed to sort of foreshadow.
I didn't know you could do that.
You can. There's no prerequisite that you have to have done a master's. It's just whether or not you would get accepted without a master's or not.
Yeah.
So I think I was just in a good position where I wrote a good proposal, right place, right time, got to know my supervisors. They really wanted to take my project on, and they kind of advocated for me to get one of the studentships and stuff. So I think I was quite lucky. But yeah, therefore I feel like it took me longer to do my PhD than it would have done had I taken a bit of a break, done a master's first. And also, I did take a year to have a baby as well, so I did technically. So maybe it's more like 4 years, not 5.
I think like taking that break, I imagine you probably didn't do too much PhD work.
No, I did. I came back to literally. She was basically teeny tiny baby when I was doing my corrections. So I remember trying to bounce her in like a baby bouncer whilst also trying to do corrections. And she used to do this thing where she would like let me have about 20 minutes and then just be like really, like you could tell she was just like, why are we doing this? Like stop typing. And I'd just be like, oh my god, I couldn't do both. So but you did yours really quickly, didn't you?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad and masters, and my masters was in psychological research. So my previous university, it was like it's their like prestigious masters that's very like research focused. So it was like a standard masters, but I got to pick all of the modules. Any module that they did, I got to pick whatever. I got to tailor my degree however I wanted, and I messed myself up because I actually selected a bunch of modules. So my first semester, all of my modules were in one semester, and then my second semester I had like basically nothing. It was very poorly loaded. But we also had like lab rotations, so I'd go to different labs and like help out. So my first lab rotation was with a PhD student who just finished, and that was like learning how to use, I think it was coding. It wasn't. It was before R, so it was coding in some kind of tool and then using it to data analysis. And then the next one that I did was somebody went, my undergraduate students messed up their data collection. I need you to rerun the entire study over the next like few months, just solo. Here's the lab, here's the study, do it. And that was really fun. I really enjoyed it. My undergraduate and my master's supervisor was the same person, and we decided that we wanted to do a PhD. So originally my PhD supervisor, she had a student back in 2011, also called Alex, and they looked at using overt speech to like control cognition. So the idea is that the inner voice that you have helps you to plan out and regulate your thoughts and your behaviour and your cognition. Can you use it out loud to then help boost that processing, because you're like double processing that information then? And they got evidence that in like a basic cognitive task, yes, you can absolutely, you see significant improvement in performance. And we wanted to then use that with Parkinson's disease to create it as an intervention to prevent freezing episodes. So we'd gone to Parkinson's UK and we'd applied to create a free intervention. The plan was this was going to be completely free because there are like walking sticks and aids that you can get that have like flashing lights and that they beep and so on, because exogenous, like external stimuli, can break freezing episodes. And we were planning on making it a free tool that was accessible to everybody and that was discreet. You just have to have like a little earphone in, you know, AirPods, everybody's got them, to have it in, and they would basically play these other instructions to break freezing episodes. But we didn't get funding, mainly because where the university was, the population density wasn't very high, and so it was way too expensive to basically ship lots of people with Parkinson's disease to us to take part in the studies. So we ended up going back to the drawing board, and I finished my masters. I kind of like dropped out of the project for a few years, and I worked in retail because Brexit happened. Mm-hmm. And I remember I was looking for PhDs the whole time, and the day that Brexit was confirmed, find a PhD online, the website, immediately switched to PhDs included in the UK, PhDs excluded in the UK, and all of the funded PhDs were excluded in the UK because they didn't know how they were going to handle Brexit, and all of the ones included in the UK were you have to fund it yourself, and I didn't have the money to do that, so I was like, everything's screwed. So I worked in retail for about 4 years, and then the government, to fight this, released the PhD student loan. So I was like, right, I'm going to go back to my supervisor, contacted her, I was like, don't know if you remember me, I'm going to do this. So we ended up using the self-talk stuff as an intervention for education in general. We didn't 100% know exactly how we were going to use it. We started out thinking about test anxiety, and then a couple of months in, COVID hit. I was due to start the 1st of January. The university forgot I was supposed to start, and I ended up spending the first month trying to just get like a profile, user account and everything. So I started the 1st of February technically, and then by like the 5th of March or something like that, everything had shut for COVID. So that's how little time I'd got to settle in. So when COVID first started, did a load of reading on my topics. Well, okay, test anxiety. I started to get really frustrated because what I realised was there wasn't a clear pipeline of how the theory developed historically from like day one. And my supervisor was like, why don't you just do a review paper then? Will you do that? And we ended up getting into math anxiety specifically, and that ended up being my topic at the end, was looking at math anxiety specifically. So I ended up doing a literature review because I was getting really, really annoyed that I was reading a lot of papers looking at math anxiety that were doing whatever the hell they felt like without really justifying or explaining it, predominantly because we were looking at executive function, cognition, and they were just using whatever task they wanted and assumed they would all be comparable to each other. So I originally did a literature review to confirm whether that had like an effect or not, and the answer was yes, it did. So I then, from that point, used that to kind of like shuttle forward what we were doing. So the goal was to create an intervention, a math anxiety intervention for schools based off of the overt self-talk. We'd done this review to refine how should we test this, what's the appropriate way to do this, but it was still COVID. So we're like, well, okay, fine. I started to explore online research. How do you do it? I did like a methodology study, like really like analysed how you run those studies online, and then ended up running them online in a way that worked quite well, to be honest. And the intervention didn't work. So we're like, oh dear, okay. So I then went back to my materials, which was this math test that we'd devised based off of other studies we'd read their instructions. And I revalidated them. I got 100 people to just do math equations for like 10 minutes, just answer these equations, and realised that the rules that people were using for their studies were rubbish. They would come up with like, oh, a subtraction is harder than an addition. No, not a universal truth. That's what we found with our study was no, that doesn't hold as a rule. And so we revalidated those tools and we reran the study with these better tools, and we found like a marginal, very, very tiny increase in performance and a statistically significant increase in the amount of time it took Interestingly though, it was a large effect size, but it only actually equated to, over the whole course of, if you did a math exam, it would take you maybe an extra 60 to 90 seconds. And my argument was always, well, for a 2-hour exam, 90 seconds is nothing. But ultimately we kind of went, but it's not enough of an improvement to bother with. So we abandoned it. This was with university students. We had planned that if it would work, we'd go to schools. And I kind of went, I'm uncomfortable running this intervention in schools, knowing that it didn't work with adults, because I don't want to damage the education of these students. So we went back to the drawing board, and I basically completely changed the direction of my PhD to go back to this original theoretical work from my supervisor's PhD student. We reran his study, but included anxiety, just general anxiety, and a couple of extra checks to double check whether they had people saying the instruction out loud to themselves and hearing it through their headphones, and we were worried there was like a dual processing, hearing it and saying it. Both had an impact independently. And so we went through and tested all this. We then did a version of the intervention just to deal with anxiety. So I've got a preprint up at the moment of a paper that confirms that yes, it does actually help. So people with anxiety, if they do like intensive cognitive tasks and they read the instruction out loud to themselves, or specifically they hear it, we gave them auditory instructions, they perform significantly better, almost to the same level as people without anxiety, which I think is actually pretty good. I do need to publish that at some point. We then took that, and from that point went, right, well, we need to get back to the math anxiety stuff. We used a method called alternating runs task switching paradigm, which is really, really powerful tool to cognitively load people, but without relying on stuff like inhibition. You don't really rely much on attention. With the way that we set it up, we don't measure cognitive flexibility, but you can with that tool. So it's a really, really effective way of very, very narrowing down functions. And so that task is traditionally done with shapes. Blue and red squares and circles is the stereotype. And I created a new version that was based off of letters and numbers to see if there are differences between people with math anxiety. And then the last study that I did for my thesis was running the numbers version of that in the setup of our original theoretical study from the previous PhD student to go, right, when we go all the way back to the theory, does this methodology help people with math anxiety with identifying numbers? Yes, it did. And so the intervention didn't work, but the cognitive theory did. And this is something that I gave a talk for this for Megan Reeves' module for our master's students back in like November, I think maybe, talking about how my like PhD was trying to bridge theory with applied work, and it did not work. And a lot of my discussion chapter was this idea that the theoretical stuff says this should work in practice, here's evidence to show it, but when we actually tried it in practice, no, because it's too complex. We'd boiled it down too much in cognitive theory for it to actually real world apply. And so that was kind of one of my like insights. It's like there's not much you can really publish from that, which is a bit of a shame, but I think it's useful like information. So we have to wrap up soon, don't we? Should we pause?
I think we should pause
and come back.
At this point, we'll have a thing in the video saying this is where we realised we were 6 minutes away from a meeting we're supposed to be at.
And we're back. I'm going to edit it to jump back to here. So I just finished talking about the research that I'd done and how it went. It was quite like by the seat, kind of like everything was just happening, and I was very reactively doing my research. I think by the end of my PhD, I did 11 studies.
That's quite a lot.
It was very busy, but I had the virtue of, because I was doing it online, a lot of the stuff that I was doing, I could just put up multiple studies and they'd run, and I didn't have to like attend to them. Something that I made good use of, and I would recommend to anybody, is if you can ask your supervisor to take on dissertation students for you. So that's what I did, whereas my PhD supervisor was eligible to have master's or undergraduate dissertation students, and I would say, I need a help in the lab, can you take on some master's dissertation students? And she was just like, yep, cool, I'll fill out the form, we'll get them in. And then the task then was we would both like run some of the sessions, like briefing the students for the dissertation. But that gave me a lot of like manpower, because one of the conclusions of doing research online was if you just release it for anybody to do, the results are really inconsistent and I wouldn't really trust them that much. But if you got in a Teams call with somebody and you turn off your microphone and your webcam and you're just there and the participant knows that you're there, they tend to behave properly. I ended up running a study after my PhD to try and revalidate something that I'd done. Really big emphasis on you need to be in your bedroom, somewhere quiet at home, dedicate an hour to this, get rid of distractions. Like, it's really important that you do this. Tried to trust the participants, and after I finished data collection, I was running another study, and one of the participants went, oh yeah, my friend did your last study. I was like, oh yeah, okay, fair enough. And he goes, yeah, she was doing it on the train. And I'm just like, my entire data set is now invalidated because I don't know who that participant was, and I know that at least one person, and if at least one person did that, other participants could be doing that as well. So I've always gone, right, I want to get a lab of students and rerun that, but like doing this method where somebody sits with them. So yeah, lots of studies and getting students to help support. So I finished mine, I submitted my thesis in 2.5 years after starting. So the average completion time is 3. I mentioned this the other day in front of Kubrick. And Kubrick goes, that's such an Alex thing though. I was just like, really? Is that... So yeah, obviously like started a month late because of like admin stuff at the university, and then I submitted. I remember submitting it, and one of my big things was, so supervisors are always different. I don't know what your supervisor, when you finish your thesis, what was your supervisor's approach to your thesis? Did they like read through it and give you feedback?
I'm trying to think back now because my memory is terrible, and you've just unlocked a core memory of the fact that I had a research assistant and I completely forgot they even existed. Okay. Like I did. They actually did help me collect a tiny little bit of data. They came to a school with me and did it. That I'd just forgotten about. What were they like when they had my thesis? So I'm trying to think. So I would have given in my kind of sort of preliminary, kind of like initial sort of copy, because like you kind of have well, you have several different versions of it, so they probably would have just seen like the digital kind of like complete version of it, I guess, in, I'm trying to think, maybe late 2017, early 2018, maybe. My Viva was in sort of autumn 2018. So yeah, I think they just took it and they read it, but they'd already read chunks of it along the way anyway. Okay. So it was more like they were just reading the complete version of it. Or maybe they would have read it sooner than that. I'm trying to think how long, because obviously once they've read it and you kind of then are happy with it and it gets submitted, you also have to allow time for like the external to read it, and kind of, I'm trying to think how long we gave them. I know that there was a lot of conversation around, we've got to get this in, looking at the time frame, because I was a full-time student as well, and obviously it needs to kind of be completed in sort of 5 years for regs purposes, full-time. Part-time is 8 years, I'm sure it is. So you have to have it completed within the 5 years. So I think they were nervous about how long the externals were going to have it, and we kind of counted it all back. So, but yeah, they would have read through it. They definitely read through it.
So I asked my supervisor, refused.
Okay.
So I had 2 supervisors. So my primary supervisor was, and my secondary were actually technically the other way around. And my secondary supervisor was the one that predominantly like,
just on paper they were.
So my primary, she read the first maybe about 10 pages, gave me a bit of feedback, and then I didn't get anything else after that. My secondary supervisor, who was my main one, she basically went, there's not really much point in me reading it, because when you submit it, your examiners are going to find problems anyway, and then you just fix them as they come up. And I get the logic. Well, you can spend ages trying to like rack your head over whether this is right now, or you can just submit it and they're just going to tell you it's not right, and then you fix it and you know what needs fixing. But I remember that and I submitted my Viva and I had like a full-blown panic attack. I had never really had a panic attack before. And I remember submitting, she'd be like, oh my God, I don't know if it's good or not. Because just like, nobody would read my thesis. But I mean, how long was your thesis? Do you remember?
About 80,000 words.
80,000? I don't know how many words. Do you remember how many pages yours was? I remember mine by the page count.
I remember it was roughly that thick, A4 double kind of like.
Okay, so it's probably similar.
Yeah.
And mine was 350 pages. So I was like, okay, it's a lot to read to like give feedback. It's like a huge undertaking. But yeah, so I never got any feedback on my draft. We'd have like some lab meetings and we'd talk about like the results and stuff like that. But it would be up to me to like write it all and then get it done. But this is what I always mention to students. I'd never known anybody to finish a PhD early, and so my emphasis is always like I started writing from almost like day one, and it was doing little bits that then accumulated into this really big piece of work. And I think there's a lot of importance around like pace in it, because I know quite a few people that would spend 3 years just focusing on the research, and then the fourth year would be writing. And I finished writing it after 2.5 years because I was writing since the start whilst I was doing my studies. I'd be running my study and I'd be writing up my last one, and then when that finishes I'd start writing that up and doing the next. But I was also working whilst I was doing my PhD as well, so after my first year I got offered a job teaching psychology in one of the colleges in the university, and then that ended up slowly ramping up the amount of hours over time as the years went on there. Which was quite handy because I was self-funded for my PhD, so I took that government loan, and then it was a case of right, got to make the ends meet, and then getting a job was definitely a lifeline because it meant that I was able to do that properly. So for everybody's reference for it, so we have to do a thesis, which is a summary. You have to have like an introduction chapter, a literature review, which could be kind of embedded in the introductory chapter. Literature review in the broader sense. You don't have to do here's a bunch of papers and it's about like building your theory that you're working essentially.
The only reason I'm going is because I supervise 3 PhD students, and I would say that it can heavily depend on the project itself. I've seen PhDs structured in very, very different ways. One of my current PhD students, for example, I wouldn't say that their opening chapter, or at least this is what we're working towards, isn't necessarily going to be an introduction, because they've kind of gone straight in and done sort of like a scoping kind of. So some people do things like they might do like a systematic review or something for kind of like chapter 1, but they've kind of gone in and done sort of like a mini kind of interview with sort of like service users within. So they've kind of talked to parents, they've talked to teachers, they've talked to kind of young people who have acquired brain injury, and they've kind of put that together as sort of like a needs assessment. So kind of like, what is it that services are missing, what is it that service users want. They've done like a little mini thematic analysis, and that kind of forms chapter 1, rather than it being a broader introduction. But I suppose it introduces the topic because it almost by default sets up what the story is. But generally speaking, there's something as an opener,
Okay, so I guess the introduction is establishing the problem, traditionally literature, but doesn't necessarily have to be. And then I think it's 2 experimental chapters and then a conclusion chapter, and then you have the ability to like mix it around. Again,
I would say it depends. So, and this is where you have to be careful as well, because one of the things with a PhD is that, and this is, don't want to scare anybody that is thinking about doing a PhD, but it's possible to be downgraded from a PhD to a master's. And that can happen if basically what you've done isn't substantial enough to basically earn you the title of a PhD. So it's more that you've done a project that really kind of actually equates to a master's piece of research. Maybe it's not enough participants, or there's not enough individual studies, or it's not been done for long enough, or whatever it is. That can sometimes happen, but because of that, I wouldn't say that there's necessarily always 2 experimental chapters. I had 4 or 5, I would say, because I had lots of individual little studies looking at different things, and they all looked at very different processes. Like I had a chapter on short-term memory, then a chapter on working memory, then a chapter on inhibition, then a chapter on attention, then a chapter on other things. And like, so, and within that, each was a sort of different kind of like big experiment that I'd done with about 150 participants. But I have known other PhD students or my own PhD students who are actually doing it in a different way, where they've either kind of like either revisited the same pool of participants over and over again, so they've structured it differently, or they've maybe actually used the thesis to kind of develop a process. So I had a colleague who did a PhD, and she used the PhD to kind of develop a framework. So I'd say that the majority of her PhD was almost like a literature review in a way, in that she was scoping the literature, developed the framework, did something else with the framework, and then she had like a single experimental chapter at the end, and then kind of brought it all together. But the actual experimental focus was quite small. It was very theoretical in nature, that PhD.
Okay, that's interesting, because I remember when I was doing mine, it was like the thing that everybody was talking about, like you have to have at least 2 experimental. Because I mean, I ended up only using 8 out of my 11 studies for my thesis, but I just chunked them into 2 chapters. But I mean, mine was an introduction chapter, and I wrote it very much like a book, because I was between educational sciences combined with psychology. I ended up writing it for cognitive neuropsychologists, which is like my background, but also for education practitioners that were not familiar with the area, because that's what the PhD was in. So that ended up like expanding quite a lot of what I was doing. So I had my introduction chapter, then the literature review paper I did, then an experimental chapter which had 4 studies. I then had like a mini, almost an introduction, and this came up in my Viva actually, where my external went, why have you got this here? Why is this not in your introduction? And this was basically, do you know what, I mentioned that my intervention didn't work and I completely changed my tone of what I was doing. It was me introducing the new methodology, and he was like, why have you got that there and not in the introduction? And I went, the easiest way to explain it is that it spoils the conclusion. If I start going, by the way, there's also this other methodology, you're going to know that the intervention didn't work, and that ruins the chronology of the work, because that's kind of important to the context of it. And his answer was, all right, yeah, perfect, no problem. And then another experimental chapter, and then my discussion section of Survivor. When you do your thesis, you get, I had, and I hear some people have it different, I had an internal examiner and an external examiner and then a chair. Did you have the same?
I had, yeah.
Okay, because I know a couple of people have multiple external. I had a nightmare getting an external examiner. It took 6 months to get one.
Yes, I'm going to admit this now. I can to this day not remember the name of my external.
Okay.
And every time people bring this up, that I get looked at like I'm either a fake academic, a bad, I don't know, something along those lines. I'm terrible with names. I'm so bad with names, and I think I've just pushed the experience out of my mind because I didn't have the best vibe. It was fine. I think I mentioned you saying that you didn't have a great one. No, you didn't like
we'll
it.
We'll talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not that I had a bad one in that like it went awful. They told me it was absolutely rubbish and blah blah blah. I only had minor corrections. It was all fine. Yeah. If anything, they actually spent too much time telling me that it was fine. They wanted me to just change this, and that was kind of it. It was almost like a non-event. But because of that, to this day, I still can't remember the name of my external because I never really spent that much time engaging with them. They read my thing, they turned up on the day, had a bit of a chat, and I've not heard from them since. So I could dig around and I could find, I know it was someone that was important in literacy and language research, and I want to say that it was Lucy Humphreys, but I'm not exactly sure if that is the person or not.
Lucy, if you're watching.
Oh God, I know, I'm so sorry, I kind of pushed that out of my brain, but I can't remember what I was going to say, but yeah, it was one external, one internal, and one chair, yeah. And I couldn't even tell you what the name of the chair was because no idea.
My chair was head of department, so I had Entley, who I knew Entley anyway. I did a bit like work with Entley, so I was just like, she just be my chair, because she was like, yeah, no problem. My internal was a staff member I didn't know, but they were the only person in the department that had anything to do with math.
Yes.
So we were like, okay, that's close enough. And it's quite awkward because I think she was predominantly qualitative, and this comes back to some of the feedback that I got and the way that my corrections were dealt with because of that. And my external was Dinesh Such, and he is a reader in statistics and neuropsychology at Cambridge, I think.
Wow.
So my original was a friend. It was somebody that I did she was a PhD student when I did my master's project, and we worked together. And she was a senior lecturer at Cardiff in educational neuropsychology. We thought, perfect, absolutely perfect. And the university went, no, she was a student here 8 years ago. And there's a 10-year, a gap between that. And okay, we tried. The next one, we found a lady that worked in Ireland, and we tried to elect her. So it was this whole hoo-ha, and we had to go through a complaints process about it. It was crazy. And we were getting quite frustrated because it had already been 4 months. And I'm like, I need to do my Viva, come on. And so my supervisor went, just give me a list of people that you've cited that are in the field in the UK. So I gave him a list, and then Dinesh was the one that came back to us. So Dinesh joined us online. And so I remember on the day I was sat outside of the room and they had problems connecting in. And I was like, oh my God, they're going to cancel my Viva. I was proper panicking. And then we got it working. And it was 45 minutes, my Viva. Traditionally, they're around 2 hours. How long was yours?
Don't know off the top of my head. Also, I'm going to clarify that I was pregnant during my Viva,
okay,
so I feel like I can put in baby brain for me not actually remembering the stress of this event. I do know that I got to sit down, because I literally had Cara about 2 weeks after I'd actually did my Viva. Hence why she was teeny tiny when I was writing on my corrections. So I think that it wasn't 2 hours, but it probably wasn't more than an hour and a half. I don't think. So, yeah.
I have heard of people that go longer. I've heard story of years ago of one where they basically went, we looked at your thesis, we know you're going to pass, let's go to the pub. And they spent the night at the pub talking about the research. And they went, we'll just sign off the paperwork in the morning. Stories you hear. But yeah, so no, mine was 45 minutes, and mine was a grilling. So you were saying that they were talking about stuff that was positive. Nothing positive was raised about my study, my thesis. It was very much a business. Why'd you do this? Why'd you do this? Why'd you do this? My biggest thing, and I ended up saying when I started, I fully realised I've messed up.
You started the Viva by saying that.
Yeah, but I came prepared. I came with the paperwork, and it was inconsequential. I know I'm going to have to fix this. I'm just going to be forward about it now. Which was, do you know, I mentioned the old PhD students' work that mine was based off of. It was, I constantly referenced it, constantly said this study, this study, this study. I never actually provided a reference. I just cited it a lot, to the point that I even said, I cited it so many times that I just assumed I'd referenced it, and I never did. So I came with copies of the reference being here it is, because I know that I'd messed that up. So really, really simple mistake. But yeah, it was just a grilling. It was just why'd you do this? A lot of focus on statistics, because my external examiner is very, very, very knowledgeable about statistics. They didn't discuss. So my second experimental chapter, the feedback was same comments for the first chapter, and then they just went, okay, shall we just wrap that up then? And I'm like, I've got a discussion chapter. We're not going to talk about the discussion chapter. Didn't say anything. They just didn't have any comments. They were just whatever. So it was just a full-on, why'd you do this? Why'd you do this? Why'd you do this? And a lot of the comments was, I wouldn't have done it that way. This is what you should do. But to be fair, they weren't horrible about it. It was for example, I had a study that I'm not going to say I didn't design it properly. I just got too ambitious and I put too many things in, to the point that the statistics model that I had to use just couldn't really cope with it. So I did a repeated measures factorial multivariate ANOVA. You can't calculate a...
Wait, say that again.
A repeated measures factorial multivariate ANOVA.
Okay, yeah.
So it was mixed, I suppose, mixed MANOVA. But you can't physically calculate a power analysis for it. It's not possible. And so I had to read a bunch of statistics papers to figure out what am I going to do. And so one of the solutions was somebody created a custom software that you could use that was based off of I don't even know if I used it properly. It was really specialist high-end statistics, like calculation stuff of like you've got to understand like the proportions between your like effect sizes before you even run the study kind of deal. So but I also saw somebody say you can pretty much do a regression, do a multiple regression ANOVA, and then like it's close enough. So I provided both of them. And I went, here's both approaches, and I'm going to go with whatever number is most conservative, the highest amount of participants, and that was fine. But when it came to analysis, there were some things that I couldn't get out of it. And so I did a bunch of t-tests because I couldn't get full level post hoc tests that I needed. And my conclusion was there weren't any differences between the groups. And I made this whole comment of, I did multiple t-tests, acknowledging that there's a family-wise error rate. So for anybody not familiar, if you do multiple t-tests, the value that you're looking for, your significance value, they kind of add together when you wouldn't expect them to. And so you shouldn't really do multiple t-tests for the same set of analyses. But I did, with the caveat that these results were not significant. So even if my value was inflated, that still wasn't enough to cause this to become significant. That's how insignificant this result was. And his response was, that's completely fair and you are right, but I'd have done it this way. So that was the kind of feedback that I was getting, that was just like, why'd you do it this way? I'd tell them, they go, well, yeah, but do this. I did appreciate that a lot of it, he was saying, like, we're telling you to do this because then when you've done it, you can just immediately publish this, which was really nice. And I kind of kick myself that I haven't published anything yet. I've got one preprint of one of those studies, but it feels like a lot of my studies weren't successful and there wasn't really much I could do, which kind of sucked. But yeah, so it was just like a grilling, and I remember being set outside of the room in the corridor, and because he was joined online, they didn't turn the speakers down, and I could hear them talking about me, and I was like, oh my god, they hate it, I'm gonna fail. And then I went in, and you have your classic, you go in and you go, okay, come in, doctor, or whatever, and you're just like, wait a minute, you said the thing. So I remember that, and that was quite nice.
Aww.
How did you feel after you passed your Viva?
Massive anticlimax. That's the thing. So mine was kind of really, again, different experience, but disappointing in a similar way, in that I went in and it more felt like a checklist of what they wanted me to do, which wasn't massively extensive, but I feel like I didn't really get the chance to kind of actually get involved and say anything. So I remember at one point sitting there listening to them kind of like talk about it, and they sort of like kind of tag teamed, whether it was the internal or the external, kind of talking about it. And I remember sitting there thinking like, am I doing this wrong? Am I vivering wrong, basically? Because I kept trying to sort of like interject and say things just like, oh yeah, but it was never a question. They were never asking me, why did you do this? Or what do you think about this? Or how do you think you could have done this differently? It was more just them going down a checklist of like, we've read this bit and we just want you to edit this here. Yeah. It kind of read, or it was like a verbal presentation almost of the corrections.
It's like a to-do list.
A to-do list, exactly, that they basically just read out to me, that then after the Viva I just went and did, resubmitted, and they signed it off. And I still to this day don't know whether to take that as kind of like a compliment in that they were happy with it. They just had these things they wanted me to change. They were just going to tell me about it, and that was just going to be it, done and dusted. But it felt like such an anticlimax, because I came out thinking like that was my one chance to talk about my thesis and stuff, and I didn't really get to do it. And did you do a presentation at the start of yours?
Yeah, they didn't tell me how long, so I prepared like a half an hour one and a 5-minute one, so I did the 5-minute one.
Okay, yeah, so I did I'm not sure exactly how long it was, but I did, that's the bit I got to sit down basically, was for the presentation, well, sat down for all of it, but for the presentation as well. And again, I wasn't sure whether or not I'd just sort of done enough kind of like in that presentation maybe to kind of them to not need me to say anymore, or kind of like I'm just not sure, but I kind of I came away just thinking, well, that was a bit weird. And I literally I went outside and I was just like, I've not really said anything for like the last kind of like hour or so. I clearly can't have done that well because I just wasn't defending myself. But then went back in the room and they were like, congratulations, minor corrections, and I was just like, okay. But it was weird. So another kind of, my other one thing that I remember from that day, so the morning that I had my Viva, I got a rejection for a paper that I'd submitted. and it was written, and it came accompanied with a personalised note, basically, from it's David Hume, isn't it? It's Hume.
Yeah.
Oh, again, terrible with names, because he was the editor of the journal to which I had submitted, and obviously a really big name in kind of like sort of working memory, executive function, blah 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 research, and basically the note said, you cannot approach this question with the methodology that you have because it is insufficient for you to test X, Y, and Z in the way that you have. The standard in the literature now is to basically take kind of a more like factorial approach, in that you want to have multiple kind of like tests of inhibition, find common variants, do whatever, and basically asking me to kind of, well, not to even bother resubmitting the paper because I basically should have done a completely different study. And I remember sitting there thinking, I'm literally about to go into my Viva with the exact framework and methodology which you've just told me is not sufficient for actually assessing any of the things that I've tried to look at. And I literally read it, probably about an hour before I went into my Viva. And I remember talking to my director of studies, just like, what do I do? Like, kind of, I'm about to go in, and what if they've got exactly the same comment? And I think she said, oh God, I hope this doesn't get out. It's going on the internet, of course it's going to go out. She basically said not to worry because he was a little bit regimented with his approach to things, and not to worry so much because he did it to everybody. And then it turned out, this is drama, this is gossip as well now, my external, whom I can't remember the name of,
Lucy, maybe not.
Maybe Lucy, maybe not. I remember having a joke with her about it afterwards, and she basically turned around and said, oh yeah, don't worry because he's a bit of a anyways.
Oh, really?
I was just
okay.
like, oh, you know what, we are probably going to have to cut this out of the podcast. Maybe cut out the words that I just said and just bleep that during the thing. And so basically she actually found it amusing that he had said what he'd said because she thought he was completely wrong. So I was lucky that I guess I had an external who was sympathetic to my methodology as well.
When you were saying that, part of me was thinking like we should do an episode. Comments if you want an episode on this of like different standards in research.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it was a huge. Because the literature review I mentioned I did, I had about 25 journals reject that paper with a one sentence response that was the same sentence every time but with like a word changed. It's educational cognitive psychology. I would send the paper to a psychology journal and they would all say this is too educational for us. And I would go to the educational journals and they'd all reject it and go it's too psychology for us. And not a single journal would actually read it and take it seriously except for one. And two of the reviewers, I had 3 reviewers, 2 of the reviewers went, this is fine, but there needs to be like major revisions, which is pretty standard. One of the problems was it was very broad and I was focusing a lot on the working memory stuff, but I also had like random bits looking at like differences in gender, and they were like, just focus on one thing. Yeah, cool, makes sense. They were like, we'd accept it, but it needs work. And then my 3rd reviewer went, this is wonderful, couple of grammatical errors, fix those, I'd publish it straight away. I was like, oh, this is perfect. The editor comes back and they go, okay, we've had the feedback back from the reviewers and our decision is we're not going to take the paper. And I'm like, everybody said yes to it. 2 of them said yes, but with some work, and one of them just said outright yes. Like, why are you rejecting this? No response. So I think it might be interesting to do a talk about difference in standards in research. I think there can be quite like massive extremes between what people expect, but also I suppose reasons why, which is what we can talk about.
There's a running joke, isn't it? It's like, isn't it always like reviewer 3 who's really nice?
Reviewer 2 is horrible.
Yeah, and it's always the same pattern. Like,
I'm usually reviewer 2. I always tell students, like, one of the things I always feel awful about was a paper, we did eventually accept it. I've reviewed like a dozen times for educational studies in mathematics. I've reviewed for cognition. I reviewed for +1 at one point. And one paper, they did a pre-post with a bunch of students across this whole university. And I noticed that one group in the post had 1 extra student compared to the pre. And this is like, we've got like 6,000 students were tested in this study, and I went, there's a discrepancy of one student that appeared in this post and this pre, and I went, you can't just add somebody in the post, because if they've not been accounted for in the pre, the data is yes, it's only one person, it's going to be such a tiny influence, it's still there. And they had to redo it, and when they resubmitted it, it was like half of their script was in red because they had to redo all of their data analysis. And I felt so horrible because it was like nothing actually changed. The numbers changed so minutely and the meaning and everything did not change at all, but the foundation still held that you cannot just add a participant in round 2 that wasn't there in round 1. So there are parts where you have to be really horrible. I ended up asking somebody actually once, I reviewed for a paper, and you see all of the other reviewers' comments, and I had this like crisis, and I had to ask multiple people. I went, I've just looked at this, and reviewer 1 wrote like 150 words of feedback. I went, I wrote a 2,000 word response feedback for this paper. I'm like, am I writing too much? And the conclusion was no, the other person's just not writing enough. But I think that's like huge discrepancy. So I think definitely worth talking about. But to go, your Viva being a list of just to do is quite interesting. Quite polar opposites. Just, okay, do this, do this, do this. The idea behind a Viva, I don't know, like, correct me if I'm wrong, is ultimately to figure out if the person that is sat in front of you is the one that did the work that has been written and submitted. So you ask them, why did you do this? To get the logic to see that it's consistent with the written work and that they don't trip themselves up. So it's quite interesting that yours was just a checklist ultimately.
True, because I could have been anybody. I could have gotten anybody to write that. Maybe I did. No, I didn't.
You heard it here first.
No,
Lucy, if you're watching.
Don't take away my PhD. I mean, pretty much like, so I've examined one Viva before. I was the internal for an applicant that we had at Coventry, and I don't know whether or not I approached it with that mindset, thinking, right, I'm going in to make sure that what I've read has been, written by this individual. I think it was more to kind of just examine the work for its worth and its quality. I guess I just kind of gave them benefit of the doubt that they were the person. But I suppose you are right, because whenever we talk about having a Viva, because sometimes we talk about having it in the context of like academic misconduct, especially for things like AI. So AI is a big problem at the moment in that, it's really hard to know how to catch if someone's used AI just to produce content. One of the ways that you can do that is have like a mini Viva where you basically ask them questions about it, because you want to know whether or not they've actually understood the topic and they can actually answer it. And I suppose in that context, it is about establishing authorship. So in a traditional sense, I suppose that's what Vivas are about. And they're certainly very different as well, depending on where you do your Viva. So I've obviously only ever examined one, and it was in the UK. My director of studies, because she is quite eminent in her field, was often invited to go examine them internationally. And the purpose of Vivas internationally can be very different as well. So in Canada, she did a few, and she said it was more like the Viva itself was a celebration. Okay. So the Viva was in front of a massive auditorium full of family, friends, other academics from the university. Yes, they had to kind of like obviously give a presentation on their work, and then they kind of had to sort of like defend their work with a panel. But she said she kind of likes and hates doing those kind of ones, because literally she was sat there almost on kind of like a sort of almost like a quiz show panel on a stage, all illuminated with loads of people watching, while she kind of like grilled this individual. But it was more at that point, the stress is lessened a little bit, because it's almost kind of more guaranteed that they definitely have passed by that point, and that actually it's more of a celebration of the work than it is anything else. So I think it definitely depends where you're doing the Viva on what the emphasis of it is. But I imagine that you're right, that originally it was to actually clarify it.
Yeah, I've got some colleagues in Sweden, and they say that Vivas are done publicly, which is quite interesting. Did you enjoy your PhD?
Yes, I did. looking back, but I don't know whether or not I enjoyed it because sorry, I'm going to go off on like, did I enjoy it for other reasons? Was it was it the last time I was child free and kind of had disposable income? And because that's the other thing as well.
You had disposable income doing a PhD?
I actually did. So I got a studentship though.
Yeah.
So I had all my tuition fees paid, and then they paid me about 17k a year to do it.
Oh, right, okay, yeah.
So I got, not only did I get paid, but I also had a part-time job that went around so I lectured and I got paid on top of the studentship that I had to actually lecture as well, hourly paid lecturer. So I was, and because the studentship is tax-free, I was swimming in more spare cash then that I got all my tattoos done when I was doing my,
lucky.
But now it's not the same with sort of like... Also, I suppose, I didn't have a mortgage at that point, so I was sort of like living, still very much sort of like student rent and all those kind of things. Yeah. But
student rent's not cheap, though.
Not now, I would say, but again, I'm pushing... So I finished my PhD, sort of like 2018, so kind of... It's been a little while now.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I'm thinking back when I was doing my undergrad. I mean, I remember paying...
Also, I lived in private rented stuff. That's my top tip. Never go through an actual, I've never rented a place that, I say it's student accommodation, I've never rented a place that is labelled as student accommodation.
Okay, like the companies that are like,
hey. Because they just whack on like 300-400 quid on top.
So I remember, university halls are always a really good price. And I remember seeing the companies that would go, hey, we've got flats for students, those are always a rip-off. Yeah, I did private in a house, and I remember I was paying something like £300 a month, but that was for a room with like 4 other people, and that was back in like 2014, and that felt wild. I don't know how much it would be now.
I think when I did my undergrad, I lived in a house with a few friends, and not all of us were students, some of us were, some of us weren't. In fact, it was a house where I think at one point all of our friends lived in at one point in rotation. It was, again, happy times, happy memories. But I don't think that was more than about £600, maybe about £500 between, at one point, probably 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 6 of us.
Really?
And then I lived in my friend's house. She'd got a mortgaged house by the time I was doing my PhD. So when I was actually doing my PhD, I just paid her board, essentially. Okay. So that was also pretty cheap. So another reason why I had spare cash, I think.
Lucky. I mean, to be fair, because I worked for a few years before my PhD. My wife bought a house, and so we were just paying the mortgage rate, which, and for like quite a small house, it wasn't that much. So I didn't do too bad actually, but yeah. So you enjoyed your PhD then?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry to come back to that kind of like question. Did I enjoy it? Yeah, I did really enjoy it. I got to meet a load of wonderful people. I got to go out and do a lot of wonderful things. So I went to no end of conferences, which again you just don't necessarily get the time for if you're kind of like full-time teaching in academia. Researchers get to do a bit more than I think we do as sort of teaching staff. So I went to no end of conferences, met loads of people, part of loads of kind of like research groups, got to get involved in lots of opportunities which felt less pressured because it felt like they were opportunities that were in addition, that's something that I could just do. So stuff like you said, like kind of like reviewing articles and stuff. So yeah, I did that during my PhD. I was a reviewer. Haven't done it since because I don't feel that I necessarily have time, but it felt like a privilege when my director of studies was just like, oh, I've been, I have this paper to review, but I don't have the time. Do you think you would like to do it? I think you'd be good at it or whatever. So taking up those kind of opportunities. I also worked as a research assistant partly during my PhD, and I got to go to Zambia for a couple of years. So not for all of the year, but for a chunk of the year, 2 years in a row, and work as a research assistant on a project with literacy and lions, which again we could probably do an episode on.
Yeah,
because literacy and lions do go together.
Is it teaching lions to read?
Yes, that's what we did for 2
Wow. And you have all of your limbs.
We had varying levels of success, yeah. No, it was... They go together because essentially, I always feel a bit... I think I spoke about this before, like briefly, like I felt like a little bit uneasy about the project at times because essentially it was measuring literacy levels in sort of children who were in both rural and kind of city-based sort of like schools in Zambia. So we were assessing literacy with the point that we were going to try and develop a program to enhance literacy. So basically there was an intervention program, and it introduced like a reading scheme, and we were kind of there sort of doing the pre-test, and then we kind of went back and did the post-test sort of like the year after, and then in between the teachers in the Zambian schools have been like delivering this intervention. But the idea being was that if you can increase access to literacy, you can then increase access to conservation education. So whilst we were there, we were also running conservation education sessions as part of the charity work. And the conservation education sessions were very much around raising awareness to not harm lions and not harm kind of like sort of like local wildlife. But I used to feel a bit uneasy about it, because essentially here we were kind of coming in saying don't kill the lions, when that's very easy for us to say from our place of privilege. It's not my livestock, or
when you don't have to worry about being assaulted by a lion,
being attacked by a lion.
A lion punches you in the street,
which they do. They put no. But it was amazing. It was so amazing, and I mean, we literally got so up close with the lions, because we lived in the research centre essentially, and the lions were in their habitat. Like they had like, you know.
Did you get to pet a lion?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Actually.
Okay,
I thought you meant
No. I would literally, we would wake up, we would go make a coffee, and we would walk down to the compound, and which was again literally only maybe about 5 minutes away, and just stroke the lions through like the mesh. I've got plenty. I would have to bring in photos.
Bring in some pictures, yeah. When we do your episode on it.
Of just sort of like cuddling up with the lions. So we also got to do like sort of, I mean, the closest I got to them was we would do sort of like bushwalks with them, and they would literally be walking alongside us, and we would obviously have kind of like security with us as well, and just to stress, these were not wild lions. We would also go out and do sort of like more like kind of like safari trips, where we were literally and that's the other part as well. It's so multifaceted. I'm going to start talking about it, and we're going to do a whole episode on it. But they were also conducting just general behavioural research on the lions as well. So we would go and we would take part in that, and we would sit and we would do lion observations. One thing I'll just never forget is that basically lions spend 80% of their time being vigilant. That's their thing. So we would have a little code for vigilant, which was V. It was either vigilant or resting. So they basically sit up, stare at things, and then they'll just fall back asleep. And then they'll do it again. They'll stare around, and then they'll go back to sleep. But that's basically what they do on repeat whilst lying under trees. Then maybe a fraction of the time they might expel some energy going to go find something to eat, but then they'll just go back to sort of like lying down and being vigilant, and then going back to sleep.
Get him a PlayStation or something. Give him something to do.
That is literally all they do. But I was so lucky that we got to do that with the lions. Then we would walk with the lions, and the majority of the lions that were in the breeding programme, because it was also part of a bigger breeding programme with different stages, they were ex-walking lions. So they'd been used for the tourist industry. They'd been trained to basically go on walks with members of the public. So they were relatively tame, the ones that we would interact with. And then they had sort of like different tiers of lions. They had like socialised lions, where they had maybe been part of the breeding programme, and they'd been like bottle fed and nursed, and then they'd kind of like been released part way. And then they had the most wild that had never had any interaction with the researchers, and they were basically children of lions that maybe had partial socialisation and so on and so forth. So it kind of started as being those that were super friendly and knew people, and then those that were less and less and less. So but the closest I got was probably the cubs that were part of the breeding programme, that were always going to be socialised, and they were always going to be walking lions, and literally we were cuddling, playing. They play like cats, and they're that little.
Surprised. I can see why you enjoyed your PhD so much.
So actually I had a really amazing experience, and I would never have got that experience if I hadn't done a PhD. So yeah.
I remember I spent time on academic Twitter when I was doing mine, and it was filled with people just like, I hate my PhD, I hate the whole experience. I loved mine. Mm-hmm. So, but it was really weird, because obviously mine started when COVID started, and I know lots of people that like crashed because of it. And it ended up like pretty much everybody that I knew had to get an extension for their PhD because of COVID, and I was just like, I loved it. I was like, I don't have to go out, I don't have to do anything I don't want to, I sit at home. I'm a very like indoors, I like being on my computer kind of person, and for me that was perfect. I remember my like first year review was cancelled and my third year review was cancelled. I had my second year review, and I remember just being like, I gave a presentation on this is what I did, and my panel being like, oh my god, have you had a break? Like you need to slow it down. And I remember being like, I do Monday to Friday 9 to 5, and some mornings I like don't even start till like 11 if I don't feel like it. Like felt like I just paced myself really consistently. But part of it as well, being self-funded with the loan, was I didn't have to have lots of like check-ins with funders, which I know lots of people had a lot of stress about. And so I was very much just left alone. It was and I often say that like my PhD experience is not normal because COVID happened, and I was just not even like not fair to say like abandoned, but just like, oh yeah, Alex is just like he does his PhD, whatever, and I just did what I wanted, and what like I wanted to do my research, so it was very much working on that and doing stuff. So it was very like self-motivated to try and push through it, and like I did one conference that was in person because of COVID. That was the Experimental Psychology Society conference. I had to get like elected to go to that. So I got elected to go to it, and I gave a talk at that. And I went to some like online conferences for like teaching and like online research and stuff like that, which were quite interesting. I did find it quite lonely, and that was one of the feedback. Every year we get like a feedback, how's the PhD going and stuff, and I'd always say I'm lonely because I don't know anybody else in the university. Like PhD students, I knew very, very few of them. So that was one of those things. But the work...
Was that a COVID thing, or was that a...
It was a mix. I think with the Educational Sciences School, they didn't have a lot of PhD students, and I was an anomaly, because educational sciences is predominantly, at least at that department, qualitative, and I'm purely quantitative. Now that did play out in my favour, because I was hired by the department to build like a suite of tutorials in quantitative statistics that was like really handy, and I did do some like statistics consultation work that I got paid for like PhD students that had to do a bit of quant. One of like the things that I was liked is that there was a PhD student that was doing some work on like literacy and in Welsh children, and I got an email one day from a lady that was doing her PhD being like, oh, Ensley said that you know quant statistics, could you help? And I ended up helping them with their stats, and I think I spoke to this lady, and she was like, yeah, the Welsh government's picking up the project, and they're going to be running with it, and that's always really nice to go like, I made a niche for myself being a quant person, but it also meant that like as a student, we did, for example, I remember we had like a conference where all the students presented their research for all the staff, because it was like let's get everybody together, COVID started to end. And it was very like eye-opening to see like the huge difference in the tone of the research, where several PhD students would just be like, well, we went and we interviewed teachers about their like opinions on like government support or whatever, and then I come in and go, right, experimental work, I had pre-post, I had this group and this group, I'd split them up in this way, I got these measurements, and we're looking at, you know, all my ANOVAs and bringing it up, and there's so many like blank faces because they're just not quant. So there was kind of this big discrepancy in terms of like maybe like identity and how I like fit in. So COVID didn't help, but I think there was still a bit of a mishmash that helped me in some ways but didn't in others. One of the things that also was quite interesting was our topic area was quite niche, that whole self-talk stuff, and I can't remember, I can get the guy's name at some point, but we ended up getting contacted by a guy, and he was like, yeah, he had like an OBE or something like that, and he was like, I don't know if it's Calm app, I think it might be Calm or Mind or one of the like big mental health apps. He goes, yeah, I'm one of the creators of this app, and he goes, I want to make a new one where I get people to like talk about their mental health and like how they feel, and then they share it with people. And basically he wanted a consultation with us. He was like, I want to hear from the researchers about this to feed into it. And we ended up like organising this thing, and we advertised it to the staff, and loads of staff came to like hear this guy present what he wanted to do. And it was always quite eye-opening, because I remember, and everyone was like, this is amazing. And I put my hand up in this. It was an online meeting, and being like, there are so many things wrong with this. I was like, ethically, from an ethical standpoint, it was literally, I remember saying to him, being like, if somebody picks up this app and records themselves going, you should kill yourself, and puts that onto the app, and you, by the way that you built this then randomly gets sent to somebody else who's like looking for, let's say, depression as a tag, and gets that, how do you claim legal liability against that if somebody then acts on that? How do you prevent that from happening? And the result was he can't. There was no way for him to do that. So from what I've seen, he kind of like it fizzled out. But a year ago, I did Google the guy and be like, oh, let's see what he's been up to. And he did make it, but you don't share it anymore. So I think he did take some of that on board. But that's always something that I kind of like. My PhD gave me lots of experience doing like statistics consultation and consultation for like this big app builder if I wanted to do something, which I think was like really cool. Just like the variety of stuff.
Did he pay you for that consultation?
No. So it was like we did it as a kind of like, we'll do it as like a research talk, and like he'll come and we'll talk to him, we'll help him out. So it wasn't paid. Some of the stat stuff was paid, but that one wasn't. But we were kind of like, we want to like engage with applied external collaborators, and like we're happy to do that just for free because like we think it's important. So that's the angle that we took with it. So that was quite interesting. So no, I really enjoyed it, but it felt quite like uncharacteristic as a PhD for like the way that it usually goes. There was a lot of like problems with the setup to my PhD. There was a lot of like administrative drama and all sorts. And then by the end of it, I was kind of like, I didn't want to end, but also you kind of want to because you want to like finish that chapter and move on to the next one. I think I would never tell anybody that my experience is characteristic. I always tell people, don't use me as an example of whether you should do one. My experience getting into it, my experience of doing it over COVID and everything is non-characteristic. My Viva is non-characteristic. So I don't know, how do you feel about yours?
Yeah, I think everybody's experience of a PhD is different. I had an incredible team who were incredibly supportive. They were almost like a mom and a big sister to me, to the point that, you know, when they chose to move to Coventry, I chose to come with them. I think I've mentioned this before, like it was, you know, I had the choice of staying at Warwick, or I had the choice of kind of like coming here for the last bit of my PhD, and it made a big difference because it meant that my PhD is technically from Coventry rather than it being awarded by Warwick. Which is a big thing because they're a different type of institution. But I not only chose to come here because I love Coventry and I love the student body and I love the whole ethos of the place and how diverse it is and, you know, what it's about, widening participation, all those kind of things. But the other big reason I chose to move was because I wanted to be with them. And you know, since then we've always kind of like worked together. We're still in touch. I used to go around their house, you know, like kind of like have sandwiches, whatever. I remember going around having tea once and all those kind of things. So it's you know, we'd go away to conferences, we'd sort of like share hotel rooms, go out for drinks afterwards, those kind of things. So it felt very I got a lot of support with it. And then when it came to them actually supporting the academic side of things, again, they were just brilliant with it. They read all of my stuff. So not only did they read it in bits, but they read the whole thing at the end, and they gave me step-by-step support all the way through. We had, you know, very regular meetings every couple of weeks, that they were always giving me that kind of like one-to-one support. But I had colleagues who I did my PhD with at the time who had completely different experiences where they barely saw their supervisors and they were very hands-off. So I think it does depend who you have, and I think that kind of, I suppose, raises the point of, well, I was going to say, like, no, I don't know if we've actually covered how it is that one gets onto a PhD, because that's probably something that loads of people want to know, is how do you get onto a PhD?
How did you get onto yours?
I got onto my PhD because I developed that relationship with my supervisors.
Same.
And they one of them supervised me for my undergraduate dissertation, and I literally booked a meeting with them because I'd kind of grown close to them and we sort of liked the same things. And I was also I went straight from my undergraduate into my PhD, but I did my undergraduate slightly later, so I've got a bit of a sketchy past. That sounds awful, doesn't it? It's not sketchy. Did Becky use that word earlier in the meeting?
Yeah.
She was just like, it's not sketchy.
No, not sketchy.
Like, so yeah.
Tumultuous. Yeah.
Not linear in its my trajectory. So I did my A-levels, and I was always, very much like an A grade student. I think in the end I did 4 A-levels because I didn't want to drop one. I got 3 A's and a B at a time when you couldn't get A stars, so that's the equivalent to 3 A stars and an A, I suppose, because it was the top marks of them. I applied to Oxford. I got shortlisted for a couple of years in a row because, again, I didn't do things straightforward. So that was another fun experience. I got took away for a week of my life for interviews at Oxford. They don't do it exactly the same now. They do it on they actually have a big, basically, aptitude test. And I also did that as well, but that's another story. So was very academic, wanted to go, and then eventually, to start with, I went to York Uni, but it didn't quite go to plan. I was too far away, and I ended up sort of quitting and kind of coming back. And I worked then for quite a while. So by the time I actually went back to Warwick to do my undergrad, I was kind of in my mid to mid-20s, I suppose, because I would have finished my undergrad in 2013 and then gone straight into my PhD. So I think because of that, I was a slightly older student than my kind of peers. I therefore was able to maybe develop a bit more of a mature kind of relationship with my supervisor because they were probably closer to me in age. And yeah, I went to go talk to them afterwards, sort of saying well, I don't know what I want to do. I want to do a forensic MSc. I think possibly, can you talk me through my options? And they kind of said, I think you should do a PhD. You should apply for one. And I remember being like, I can't apply for a PhD, don't be ridiculous, I'm never going to get a PhD. It wasn't even on my radar. And they kind of convinced me to apply for it because the project that I'd done for my undergraduate was similar to one that they were thinking about doing for a PhD anyway, or having a PhD student do. So I put the proposal together with their support, and then they advocated for me to get one of these kind of studentships that were available. So it was kind of I think unless I'd had that kind of relationship with them, and they obviously knew my aptitude from working with me throughout my undergraduate, so I was it was flattering to know that they wanted me to apply for the PhD. But that's basically how it happened. Obviously, I don't know if we've probably mentioned this before, but imposter syndrome is a huge thing. I think I suffered hugely from imposter syndrome because I kind of felt that I'd almost taken a back door into the PhD process because all of my other peers who I were originally at Warwick with were external candidates, so they very much had to kind of out of nowhere put their research proposals in, been sort of scrutinised. And the way that it worked for me was that basically at the time the Department of Psychology were told that they were going to get 5 chunks of funding, and then it was on the directors of studies to look through their pile of applications that they'd had, choose which ones they wanted, take them to a panel and argue why their chosen person should get one of these magical studentships. So they took mine and advocated for it, plus maybe one other or something, and it was mine that kind of got selected. But I felt that all of those that had come externally had probably been up against, I felt anyway, a lot more kind of external pressure, but probably not, because in the end we did all go through the same process. But I did at the time feel like I'd taken a bit of a backdoor in. But a lot of PhDs are like that. It's about getting to know the person and then being taken on. So I didn't actually know that the government had started doing PhD. I know that they do master's loans.
It's the same one. So I didn't do a master's loan for my master's. I worked for the university.
Oh, that makes sense, because you can only have one postgrad loan.
Yeah, so I took out that at the maximum 25,000 for the postgraduate loan to cover my PhD. Obviously, that not being enough to do everything, then got a job. I managed to squeeze that. It was literally the day that they announced the master's loan could now also cover PhD. I like emailed my old supervisor, and she was like, "Of course I remember you. Come in next Thursday." And
so that's really good. So I guess then it gives them a bit more flexibility in who they take on as well, because they can...
Yeah. So I thought it was actually kind of a weird process. So almost the same as you, that I feel like my entry to my PhD was based off of who I knew and not what I knew. And I hold this idea based off of other people I've known and how well, like how their PhDs have gone. I don't hold the view that PhDs are like related to intelligence. I know there's this view that only smart people do it. I think it's almost like a, not quite personality, but I think it's like almost like a skill thing. It's resilience. It's like it's consistency. It's not knowledge. There is a degree to where you have to like be able to understand and work stuff out. But I don't view what I'm able to do any better than somebody that does like coding and just creates an app, for example. I don't think that I do anything that's more special than them.
You're right, because I think over the years, so like, yeah, I've got 3 PhD students, but they weren't students that I've come on to their projects as like second supervisor, so they weren't ones that I necessarily selected as such, or at least I've been invited into the project. I'd say one of them slightly different, because one of them I've worked with and I've known for like many years, so I would say that was a selecting process, because I knew them and I encouraged them to apply for the PhD, and they all sort of came together. But over the years I've had students that I've worked with that I've kind of, and they've not necessarily been the most academically able, but I've almost had that voice in my head go, they would make a great PhD student because of the other aptitudes and skills that they have. I know that they'd be there, they'd be showing up, they'd be writing, they'd be getting the work done, they would be autonomous, they wouldn't need hand holding, those kind of things.
I think those are more important. Like, I failed psychology in college. I had to resit A-level psychology. I failed philosophy and psychology. There was a problem with that year with the philosophy.
Sorry,
I might have spoken.
No, go for it.
So I had to either drop psychology or philosophy, and I went, I'm going to drop philosophy because there was a problem with that module that year, and I went, I'm going to redo it. Resat psychology, got a B, and then throughout university I was like a B grade student, and I've always been kind of like coasted at the B, but always tried to do like extra stuff. I was really, really involved in like extracurricular activities in my undergraduate degree. That was like who I was. And yeah, so I think I've always felt that like doing a PhD has always been like an approach based thing rather than intelligence. Like, intelligence helps, but I think there's a lot more to it that like really underpins that. So yeah, I started my PhD because of who I knew, because it was my supervisor for my masters and my undergrad, and we built a good relationship because of like I was just engaged with research, and I would like, we'd have lab meetings and I'd always be asking questions and like trying to like get involved in that discussion, and she just kind of latched onto that as being like a good thing. There were like, I mentioned, like there was admin drama doing my PhD, and that then like kicked in at that point. But that was like finding ways to navigate around that. But yeah, you were going to say something.
You just reminded me about my A-level philosophy. So that was the one that I got a B in. Oh. And I really should have got 4 A's, but I think I spent my second year of my A, but was then an A2 year, in the pub too much.
Too much in the pub? Oh, I was going to say, is this a chip on the shoulder? But maybe it was...
We had a change in teachers, and I think it speaks volumes for kind of, again, the relationship that you have with the person who's teaching, and I don't think that any of the class showed this poor, brand new philosophy teacher any respect. Bless him, he was quite new to teaching. I think we knew that. He was a bit like a lamb to the slaughter. And this is awful as well, because like I went to like an A-level college that was just A-levels as well. So it was an ex-grammar school, and we were all really quite mature. We got to sort of like wear whatever clothes we wanted. We were all there because we were interested in learning, not because, you know, we just had to stay in education, because at that point you could still leave at 16. It wasn't like now as such. So, you know, we gave utmost respect, but for some reason, for this one poor teacher, he just kind of turned us into school kids, and it was awful. And we would do things, but we'd be like because his name was James, bless him, we'd be like, James, we're going pub. Like, we're not in, like, we would get up, like, partway through the session and just be like, I don't think we're going to stay, I think we're going to, and that, I don't know why I did that, because isn't that awful? There's got to be some psychology in this, because I am not that kind of student. I know, I don't know what, and in the end, I swear, all of us went from kind of being on, and the year before, I think the problem also came from the fact that the teacher we had for our AS year, and she'd gone on maternity, was incredibly strict. She was a lady called Zoe, and she was so strict that we were all kind of like really quite scared of her. And I think it was almost that sort of like disjoint between like the two that meant that by then, when we did have some breathing space, then we're all just like, oh, we're done. We can't deal with this anymore. And I think everybody pretty much dropped from sort of like an A to a B, apart from I think one person in our year still motored through and got an A, but nobody else got an A because nobody listened. I
don't know about you, but I always think I'd love to like get back in touch with my A-level psychology teacher. I don't remember her surname, Sarah, and I just remember she put up with some real problems. And like saying, you know, I failed, and she like really helped me to like pull that back up, and now I'm doing this. So I was like, oh, I wonder what she's doing. I wonder how she's getting on, if she still does teaching psychology.
You ought to go back, if you can, like into a class and basically give that story of like, yeah, I was here in this class. If you can go back to your college and be like, I actually failed, but now I'm lecturing psychology.
Yeah, look at me now. Can't stop me. Yeah, I don't know. So I think we're going into this episode, so it might be a short one. I think this is an extra long one today.
I think so, yeah. And we didn't even touch on the difference between PhDs and professional doctorates.
We didn't. I think we'll come back to that one.
Yeah, because they're a whole different thing.
I think a lot of the focus today was on our experience, and we've spoken to a couple of other colleagues, and they've said that they'd be interested. I think it'd be nice if we did as a series, almost an interview, a podcast, get somebody down, tell us about where did you come from, tell us about your PhD, what did you do, what do you do now, and all of that. I think might be kind of like what we did today. Would be quite nice. My last fact, which started as in all of this, is that in the UK, on average, it takes 3.5 to 4 years to do a PhD. So we just talked for like an hour, almost, based off of that little fact. So there you go. We've got that. So PhD, thumbs up, enjoyed it.
Yes.
Yeah, I think
would never go back. Yeah, you know how sometimes you have that kind of like, you think about whether or not you could reverse the years if you, and like how you would do, like you would ace things so much better. I definitely wouldn't reverse before PhD time. It would have to sort of be like kind of then forwards, because I think it's such a big achievement that also I just don't know whether or not I could do it all again, kind of like, because it is a lot of
modern
work.
Day, like I didn't do it that long ago, but even now with all like the AI and everything, I don't know how it'd go, because I know there's lots of talks about PhD theses and AI and research and stuff.
That's true.
I'm glad I like finished a few years before that started to be a problem. But yeah, I had another thing I was going to mention. It just immediately dropped out of my head at that point.
Sorry.
So I'm not sure what I was going to say. It's something to do with the PhD, but
said thumbs up.
Thumbs up. We enjoyed it.
We enjoyed it.
Would recommend it.
If they want to find out more about...
Yeah.
I mean, at Coventry, again, we're slightly different in that we... So when I did my when I did my PhD, I had a studentship, but you could self-fund. You obviously mentioned self-funding. At Coventry, we've kind of got a mix of both. So we do have some self-funded students, and we also have some PhD pathways, and we have a doctoral college. So we have research centres that are by theme rather than subject. So we have the Centre for Global Learning, Education and Attainment, so that's all research to do with kind of like education, and both domestic and kind of international education. But then we also have like the centres for like healthcare, we also have like engineering and different sort of like subjects. So within those research centres you might have psychologists, linguists, sociologists all working on similar themes. So if you're interested, Google Coventry University Research Centres, and that will take you to a page that shows you all the different research centres, and then you can click on them, and then throughout those individual pages they'll explain the different PhD opportunities and processes to go through, and there are lots of different options available.
I suppose as well, I'm going to drop us in it, and if you're not sure, I'm sure they can probably email just us, somebody at the university, and we can forward you on. I suppose comment section, YouTube comment section or something. I monitor them. Maybe not every day, but I do check in every now and then. I'll put a link to the research centres if anybody wants it. Just say, can I have the link, and I'll put it in and do that. I think it's very much worth doing. I absolutely love doing my PhD. You love doing it. It opens up a lot of opportunities, specific careers. I wanted to be an academic. I'm assuming you're the same.
Yeah, I wanted to teach.
Yeah, teaching, that was the main thing. I originally went into my degree wanted to do counselling, did my biopsych module in first year and went, I want to do this. And that's what I ended up doing, was teaching neuropsychology stuff and all of that. So we'll wrap that up there. So thank you very much, everybody. A bit of a longer one than expected, but I think it's been very personal experience and deep for this one. And I've booked Ravi in for Friday, so look forward to the episode with Ravi in 6 months.
Leave it when I see it.
Yeah, it's going to be 6 months time. As soon as it's recorded, I'll post it. Hopefully it's the next episode, but I've said that the past 3, so we'll see. But this is the closest we've ever got, because we've actually booked a date with him and a time here on Friday at 10 a.m.
10 a.m.
So that's...
I'm on annual leave, but I'm going to come back.
So am I.
We're both on annual leave.
We're both, but yeah, I'm so sorry.
It's alright, but
okay.
That's how dedicated we are to this podcast.
Yeah. Okay, let's wrap that up. Thank you very much, everybody. Again, any comments or anything, if you need any support thinking about a PhD, they're very individualistic, and they're the kind of thing that you tailor with your supervisor. I think the supervisor is the main thing. I think that's one of the things I wanted to say earlier, is your supervisor makes it. My supervisor was absolutely fantastic. Even, I said, I didn't read my last draft or whatever. I completely understand the logic of I could spend all week doing this, but submit it, they'll flag it for you. But the whole process was very supportive, and you need a supervisor you get on with, and I think that's important for education as a whole. And we often say, even an undergraduate degree, you see university, the staff are really friendly. That's really, really important, and I think that's something that we don't talk about enough, is how important it is that you socially gel with your supervisors and your teachers and so on. And so that's I think a very powerful takeaway. Right, thank you very much, everybody, and we will see you in a couple of weeks for the next episode, which may or may not be Rafi. We'll see.
We shall see.
Cool.